in Islamic law, men can marry more than one wife. Men can marry up to 4 wives in Islamic law. And this institution, this practice of polygamy, of course, is something that is a very controversial topic, especially from a Western perspective. And so I think it's important to talk a little bit about polygamy, about the situation in which it arises, and what polygamy is like within the Islamic context. First of all, I mean, it needs to be clearly stated because sometimes there is misconceptions. Polygamy is allowable within Islam. It is not required. It's not even necessarily the ideal situation of marriage, but it is certainly allowed. Polygamy is practiced much less today than it was in the past, and 2 Muslim-majority countries have actually banned polygamy, Turkey and Tunisia. And other people have called for either bans or restrictions on polygamy because of its lack of necessity in the contemporary social context. But nonetheless, it is still there, and it is still a possibility. First of all, as I said before, polygamy was something that was already practiced in pre-Islamic Arabia in a way that was unlimited. Some people have suggested that putting a limit of 4 wives on the number that a man could take was in fact a limit on what had existed previously. Of course, it's difficult to say because we don't know that much about pre-Islamic Arabia. But the verse that permits polygamy is one verse in the Quran at the very beginning of the 4th surah, the surah on women, Surah Al-Nisa, in the 3rd verse. And you have it in your handout. And if you fear that you will not be able to deal justly with the orphan girls, then marry the women of your choice, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with them, then only one, or those that your right hand possesses. That is more likely to prevent you from doing injustice. The legitimacy of polygamy in Islam rests on this particular Quranic verse. Something to notice is that it is framed in 2 conditional sentences. If you are not able to deal justly with the orphan girls, then marry 2, 3, or 4. And it doesn't say if you think you're going to get bored with just one wife, if your wife can't have children and you don't want to divorce her, if you think that you really need to have at least 20 children, then marry up to 2, 3, or 4. That is not the reason that is given. Now, in Islamic law, no restriction is given on the reason for practicing polygamy. And this is because not only is polygamy established as a possibility in this verse, but of course Muhammad himself and his close followers practiced polygamy in Muhammad's time. But I think it is important to look at the structure of the Quranic verse itself and to think about what it is saying. Yes, I'm sorry, you had your hand up. Yes, if you had, of course, situations of widows and orphans were a real problem in the early Muslim community, especially when you had people who, as I said, made the emigration from Mecca to Medina. And you would have a woman and children who might be widowed and orphaned now, but they could not be sent back to their family in Mecca. I mean, they were at war. And one of the things was that people in Islam, there isn't really adoption as we know it today in the sense of adopting another child, giving that child your name and considering it completely your child. There is foster parentage, and that's very much a meritorious thing to do in Islam, is to take a child into your home. But you don't give that child your name. The child retains its paternal lineage so that they can inherit from their father who is deceased. But yet they're minors. So you're a foster parent for this child that might be coming with a certain amount of money. And it cannot guard that money herself. And so it says, if you fear you may not be able to deal justly with them. In other words, you might be tempted to use some of that money to care for them or for something else less honorable, then marry them, because marrying them puts you in a very clear legal obligation to them. You are then responsible for caring for them. And again, it hinges on the issue of justice. If you can't do justice among them, then one. And later in that same surah of the Quran, verse 129, you will never be able to do perfect justice between your wives, even if it is your ardent desire. So do not incline too much to one of them, so as to leave the other hanging. And if you do justice and do all that is right and fear God by keeping away from all that is wrong, then God is forgiving and merciful. So it's the situation in which polygamy is Quranically mandated on the basis of the literal reading of the Quran is that it is a protection for orphan girls who might otherwise be exploited or taken advantage of. Even within that context, again, the protection comes in the issue of dealing equivalently with them. And I'll take your question 1 second. The fact that a man cannot deal, it says here, cannot deal equivalently. Some people, even the 20th century Egyptian theologian Muhammad Abdu, tried to argue that perhaps maybe you shouldn't really do polygamy in this particular case because you have these two verses together. But I think that's a hard argument to make, actually, because you do have this precedent in the early Islamic community. Yes, I'm sorry.
You mentioned that Tunisia has banned polygamy.
Mm-hmm.
So not only is it ignoring a Quranic injunction, it's also ignoring Sharia, which also recognizes that free men may marry 4 women, free or slave, but no more.
Mm-hmm.
So doesn't this complicate the whole question of the relationship between the state, which necessarily in Islam must interpret and apply the law, and the transcendental source of revealed law? How can those two be reconciled? Isn't this a very good case of a tension between those two sources of authority?
It is, and certainly there are a lot of people who would argue your case in terms of not banning polygamy, precisely because it is something that is permitted clearly in the Quran and in the tradition of Muhammad, and therefore also in the Sharia, and so that this is not legitimate. Their perspective was to say that, the Quran allows polygamy, the Sharia allows polygamy, it does not mandate it.
Doesn't this sound like a piecemeal adoption of Islamic doctrine, which, as was stated earlier, could be characterized as heresy?
Well, yes. That's taking kind of a very idealistic view of the incorporation of Sharia into Islamic states today. It's not really the case. You don't have full incorporation of Sharia law into the states today. Sharia law, and in some ways, it's a bit incompatible with the modern state view of law.